Now, there are other related forms. We've been talking about things as pronouns, but there are also forms that do the same basic job as pronouns, but instead of pointing at noun phrases, they point at other kinds of things. Whoops, I didn't list them out. Oh well. So, for example, there are pro-adverbs, where, why, when. Those don't replace nouns, they replace adverbial kinds of things. There are even proverbs. There are forms that replace a verb phrase. Do so is the big one. We'll talk about that when we study verb phrases, right? So pronouns are the most common type of a larger set of what linguists call proforms for it, right? Here's a traditional pattern for a verb, right? There's a lot of repetition in this pattern, right? In a lot of the traditional patterns, we just list out everything even when there's no changes. If you look across, you'll notice English doesn't actually have all that many variations. Like if we were looking at the equivalent form in a different language, there would be a lot more endings changing throughout these different things, right? I've illustrated the different forms for a couple of different classes of verbs: walk, swim, and to be. What this is, yeah. So, like as with nouns, verbs can distinguish in number, although they, for most verbs, they only do that for the present tense, right? So walk, he walks versus everything else walk, right? So we have a special form for the third person singular. So he walks, they walk, right? So we do distinguish number there, although I walk, we walk doesn't change, you walk doesn't change whether it's singular or plural. And then in the past tense, there's no difference in why it's walked all the same, right? The persons that we had with the pronouns, they also exist with the verbs, although again, we don't have complete differences for each one, right? There's only a few forms that are at all different. Now, swim is an example of what's traditionally called an irregular verb, right? So we have swim, instead of saying swimmed by adding an ed, we have a special form, swam, right? Swim, swam, swum, right? Walk is a regular verb, right? There's a pronunciation difference. It's regular because it forms both the past tense and the past participle by adding ed to the end, right? There is a pronunciation difference between like walk, the past tense for, say, walk, and the past tense for jog, because walk, because it ends in a k sound, the ed ending becomes a t, right? It becomes devoiced. We were talking about these allomorphs last time with like plurals and how you get dogs, but cats, right? You get the same exact principle here, right? Walked is a t sound, right? The spelling preserves the ed, but jogged, d sound, right? Because the g is voiced, so d is voiced. The k is unvoiced, so t is unvoiced, right? But that's just an allomorph. That's just a pronunciation difference, right? We still say it's regular because it's adding the same basic morpheme to the end, right? Even though it has an allomorph. in the pronunciation. The irregular ones are swim, swam, swum, are ones where, so what we talk about normally with English, if you notice this complete paradigm, there's a lot of redundancy, right? So normally we focus our attention on three basic forms in English. The base form, right, which is illustrated by like the infinitive, right? Or and often it's exactly the same for like that same base form is what you find in say first person singular, or first person present tense, things like that. So the base form, the past tense form, and what's traditionally called the past participle. Those three forms give you, with the exception of verb like to be, which is highly irregular, but those three forms for pretty much every other verb give you all the information you need in order to completely conjugate a verb in English, right? So walk, walked, walked, right? For the regular verbs, that's basic, right? The irregular verbs, you just have to memorize the specific pattern. So swim, swam, swum, eat, ate, eaten, right? Ring, rang, rung. What about bring? What are the other forms for bring? Okay, I fooled so, but so is not a native speaker, so that doesn't count. I was hoping to get, I was trying to prime you. I was like, ring, rang, rung, bring, and I was hoping that, and so fell for it, but like I said, not a native speaker, doesn't count. Bring, brang, brung was what I was hoping for. But no, it's not. That's not the pattern for bring. The pattern for bring is brought. Bring is in the same category as teach. Teach, taught. Bring, brought. Right. Bring, brang, brung. Yeah, I like that one. When I have live classes, I can usually get some students to say bring, brang, brung out loud. They're typing it out. Yeah, brought, ought. Ought's slightly different, but it rhymes anyway. Teach, taught is the right paradigm. So there's those are traditionally called irregular verbs in English. What they really are, they really belong to sort of minor patterns of verb conjugations that go back to the ancient prehistory of English, right? Yeah, you didn't do the whole thing. You did say brang. You said brang brought, so you did half the paradigm right. So, but well, I mean, and also before you make too much fun of anybody for doing something like that. I mean, even native speakers do occasionally, like the normal trend, because these irregular verbs are rarities, like they're unusual against all the normal pattern of English. Not that they're rare verbs, in fact, quite the opposite. The pressure over the history of English has been to regularize a lot of historically irregular verbs, right? So yeah, you might hear brang for that. That's people back forming it. Dove. We were talking about dive, dove, right? Historically, dive is a regular verb. Historically, it's dive, dived. But a lot of people are starting to say dove. Like, I dove yesterday, right? Like talking about scuba diving, right? I have not yet heard anybody say divin. I have divin for 30 years or something like that. But I've dived for 30 years, for it. But the point is that even though historically that's a weak verb, people by analogy, right, with like ride, rode, ridden, have created dove, right? Yeah, so that one is a historical verb, right? That's one that gives a lot of people trouble. Except it's not laid, scintolo, it's lay is the traditional past tense there. Lie, lay, lane is the traditional correct form for that. Hand dove scallops. Yes, there you go. So, yeah, it's sorry, I'm getting thirsty. I'm going to grab another beer. Be right back. Think about diving and doving. You dove over and over. Gosh. Bins, bins, bins. Beer makes me thirstier. Depends on how strong the beer is, I suppose. Some beer quenches your thirst, others. Thank you. So, talking about dive, we were talking about conversion between nouns and verbs. A dive is a perfect example of a word that is the result of conversion. Off the cliffs of Dover. Yes. But yeah, a word like, I mean, most verbs go the other way, right? From the irregular, or if you study like Old English, they're not called irregular verbs, they're called strong verbs because they have this ablaut something. I don't know. The Germans who came up with these terms thought that it was somehow more manly for verbs to change their internal vowels than to weakly add an ending to the end. So they're strong verbs, right? I don't know what a really strong verb is, right? I mean, ancient Greek. So you would probably know this. There's an ancient Greek play that has a verb. It's one of the comedies. It has a verb for to be sodomized, to be reamed up the ass with like a long, large radish. Now that's a strong verb in my book. Yeah. I'm going on old memory here. I'm pretty sure it was a large white radish or something like that. One of these verbs that's sort of invented for the purpose, right? But so at any rate, swim, swam, swum, right? And then the final set of columns, you did find it. Okay, so I'm not hallucinating. It's the clouds. Yeah. Yeah. No, sorry that you have some hay fever, Bins. That sucks. Um, I mentioned to be separately. It is probably the case that everybody here is fully familiar with this as a verb, but I do mention it. I want to mention it specifically because in a lot of my like basic grammar for teacher classes back when I was doing that sort of formally, a disturbing number of my students, people who were planning to become teachers, right, were unable to recognize like am or is or was, whatever, as verbs, right? Probably because they're not expressing an action. They're just sort of those one of those colorless function words that you run across in the sentence, and you don't really think very much about them, right? But obviously they are verbs. It's like the most commonly used verb in English. Also the most highly irregular. It's the only one. I think there are like 7 distinct forms, or is it 8, of this verb, right? We'll get to intransitive verbs when we cover the verb phrase, Walter, which will be probably 2 weeks from now. I think my plan currently is to do noun phrases next week and then verb phrases the week after that. Right? And when we do verb phrases, we'll talk about intransitive and transitive verbs, what the heck that means and why we care. But the main things that I wanted to point out here about the way things are broken down, we have singular plural, we have person, we have tense. I'm going to have a lot to say about tense later on as well. I will give you one little quick preview. Everything that or almost everything that you were taught about tense in English, I'm not making this assertion about other languages, but English tense, if you were learning about it in a native English-speaking classroom, is almost certainly wrong. So, yeah, to be or not to be. I mean, be is what we call the infinitive form of the verb, right? If you look at these, I mean, I've given these, we have the tense forms, and then we have these infinitive, imperative, present, past participle. We'll talk a lot about how they're used in particular contexts in later weeks, right? But but when we say using be as a verb, like, there's 2 ways you can interpret that, right? You can interpret that as be as the individual word form, or be as the lexeme, as the head word of the lexeme. In other words, be as the catch-all for all of these inflected forms, right? So if I say I am happy, I'm using a form of to be, right? It might not be obvious because, right, am, is, was, were, be, being, like they seem like they're totally different verbs. And historically, there are 3 different verbs that collapse together into one paradigm, right? But, you would say to be, you would also use it in an imperative, like be quiet, right? Good old Monty Python reference, be quiet. Oh, see what is it? Just inherit in the, see the oppression inherent in the system. Help, help! I'm being repressed. Right? So yeah. So a little bit more about these. We mentioned regular, irregular. Now, another distinction that's going to come up a lot, and I want to mention. Yes, see the violence inherent in the system, is the difference between finite and non-finite verbs. And this is an important one. The easiest way, although it's not exactly accurate, the easiest way to think of a finite verb is as a verb that has a tense. So like a present tense, a past tense, those are finite verbs. There are a few other forms that are finite. And then non-finite verbs, well, an infinitive, to be, to do, that's one. The forms that we were looking at with the that are called participles, those are also non-finite. Now, what this means technically is that a finite verb, where these names come from, finite verbs are limited. They're made finite by particular qualities like person, number, tense, right? Things like that. So if the verb is changing form because of these things, or if it's limited to appearing only with like a particular person, then we call it a finite verb. Right. If it doesn't have that limitation, if it's used no matter what, then it's non-finite, right? So not limited. So, to do, to go, there's no special form for like the present and past of to do, to go, whatever. There's no, the ing form of the verb is the same across the board, right? It doesn't change. So we call those non-finite forms. So anything with a tense is finite. Imperatives and subjunctives, which I'll talk about briefly later, are also finite forms, right? Go to the store, be quiet. Those are imperatives. They give commands. Subjunctive. What counts as subjunctive is actually... There's a difference between what the traditional books say and what the modern linguistic books say. So I'm not even going to try to define the subjunctive right now, other than to say it's not as bad as you might fear given your language studies or the prescriptive grammar stuff that you might have heard about it. So, yeah. Non-finite forms. Okay, so the so-called present participle, the ing form of the verb. Every verb in English, there's no, there are a handful of verbs. There's one or two verbs that don't have a participle form. They're sort of anomalous. But in fact, the only one I can actually think of is the verb beware, which has only the base form. You can't say he is bewaring, right? Or he bewared, or he bewares, right? Beware, it has to be used only as the imperative form. But apart from a few anomalous exceptions like that, every verb in English forms the present participle exactly the same way. We add ing to the end. So running, swimming, walking. Okay. So Abby is playing with Bear, right? Progressive. Now, this is traditionally called the present participle. That's what most books will call it. The thing to be careful of is I just got through telling you that a tense form is a finite form, and this is a non-finite form. So why are we calling this a present participle? In fact, it's a stupid name. There's nothing present about this participle. You can say Abby was playing with Bear, the past tense. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently present about it. It is found commonly in the construction that's called the progressive, which we'll talk about when we do the verb phrase. So I like to call it the progressive participle just so that you don't get it confused with tense, right? Now, in traditional grammar, we also have this thing called a gerund, which, like, playing with Bear is good luck for a run. So in traditional grammar, these are two different things. But practically speaking, they're more or less the same, right? The reason why they're distinguished is largely a matter of Latin grammar. In Latin, you have a different form for the gerund than you do for the participle. In English, we use the same form. Again, we'll say I'm sort of throwing these terms out just to give you a general overview of where we are, but we'll go through this in more detail later, right? Just as we have a present participle, we also have a so-called past participle, right? just as with the present participle, there is nothing inherently past about this past participle. It is used for a form that's called the perfect, which does involve past time. So maybe this has a little more justification than present participle. But just as with the present participle, there is no tense to this verb. It's a non-finite form. The past participle is the form that you use. In fact, I miswrote this. This slide says progressive / perfect participle. That should say passive perfect participle. I'll correct this slide before I put it on the Discord. So the way to think about this is basically it's the form you use after have, right? So, you know, they have run, they have swam, they have walked, and so on, right? That's the past participle form. Does not have, even though walked looks identical to the past tense, when it's in the participle form, it doesn't have a tense. It's not the same thing. There will be times when this will be relevant, right? So infinitive, the most common thing, the way you're probably used to talking about it and thinking about it, is when it appears with to in front of it. To run, to swim, to walk, but you don't actually always need that to. In phrases like let him go, that go is an infinitive verb, right? We don't say let him to go, right? You might ask for him to go, right? But let him go, though it's called the bare infinitive. The infinitive form also appears after other verbs that we call auxiliary verbs. We'll study auxiliary verbs when we do the verb phrase. That also is the infinitive form. Yes, a bare infinitive. Pun intended. Or I should say pun fucking intended. Okay. Adjectives. The right answer to this one was late. Lived is a verb across the preposition. Plain here, plain can be an adjective, but here it's being used as a noun. Notice the plain. And for the adverb, the right answer here was reluctantly. As you can tell, we're going to talk about adjectives and adverbs right now. They're actually very similar to each other. Start with adjectives, right? The normal usage, adjectives specify something about a noun, right? A character, or limit the application of it. So a large refund, right? How big is the refund? Enthusiastic participant, right? What kind of participant do we have? Purple prose, what kind of prose are we talking about here? So all of those would be examples of adjectives, right? Most adjectives appear immediately before a noun. A handful appear after, mostly in sort of formal language, right? The president-elect, right? Attorney general. The general is actually, you might think of that as just a stock, as general as a noun, but in fact, that's an adjective, right? And which is why the formal plural of attorney general is not attorney generals, but attorneys general. Adjectives can also appear on their own after a linking verb. So we'll talk about what linking verbs are in detail later, but to be is a linking verb. It just connects the subject and the thing that comes after the subject. So Dina was happy to settle down on a farm, right? So happy is an adjective, comes after. So when the noun appears in front of, when the adjective appears in front of the noun, we call it an attributive adjective. When it appears after the verb like this, we call it a predicative adjective. It's attributive even if it comes after the noun, president-elect. as long as it's part of the same phrase, right? President-elect, the purple prose, right? Those are directly modifying the noun. There's not a verb in between. If they come in the predicate, like after the verb, then they're predicative adjectives. Now, most adjectives can be used in either place. Some can only be used attributively. Notice you can talk about my main problem being, I don't know, lack of sleep, right? But you can't say my problem is main, right? This is an adjective that can only appear in front of a noun, right? Mere is another one. Her mere presence is fine, but you cannot say her presence is mere, right? So attributive only. And they're also predicative only adjectives, right? Ellie was ablaze with a desire for revenge, right? Ablaze is an adjective telling us a characteristic of Ellie. But notice you can't say the ablaze teenager, right? So one or the other. These are arbitrary facts about the language. Ablaze, infected. Yes, the infected are ablaze after Ellie threw the molly, but the ablaze infected is anomalous, right? So adjectives, that's syntax, morphology, right? Adjectives, you can take most adjectives and change them into adverbs by slapping on ly. Not all, but it's the common process. So happy, happily, and so on, right? Now, a lot of adjectives have what's called a degree. They participate in a grading system, from the base system to a comparative to a superlative. So strong, stronger, strongest. That's the inflected form for words, mostly words that are, all words of 3 or more syllables and many of 2. It depends on the word. Instead of using the ER endings, you use more and most, right? What's called the synthetic degree instead of the inflected degree, but the same basic idea, right? So it's on a continuum, and we're establishing what grade along the continuum we are. Right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Time. Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to talk about. Yeah, Greek has a much more complicated tense system than English does, and we'll talk about it. All right, Davey. Happy lurking. Appreciate it. So how do we tell if something is an adjective? One of the best or most useful tests is the very test. Now, this isn't exclusive to adjectives, but it will certainly distinguish adjectives from other things, especially verbs, because often there'll be a question of, is this a verb or is this an adjective? And the very test is very useful for this. The basic thing is, for most adjectives, you can add very in front of them. So she is very slow, right? Any adjective that takes a degree ending, or synthetic degree, will take very, right? But notice you can't do that with a noun. Very fools waste time. That's ungrammatical. You can't do that with a verb. He very adores her, right? So if you can tack on very, that's good. However, it only works for gradable adjectives. There's a relatively small set of adjectives that do not permit this sort of comparison, largely because they express what are traditionally described as absolute qualities, something that's either all or nothing. How very, yes, how very, very. So a word like present, if you think about it, at least unless you're using it in some kind of metaphorical sense, present is an all or nothing thing. You're either present or you're not present, right? So the present situation, and present especially meaning current time, right? It doesn't really make any sense to say the very present situation, right? It just doesn't work. Now, if you're using present in the sense of, in the kind of like new age hippie sense of aware, right? You might talk about, oh yes, after meditating, I just felt very present. Right. I mean, like in that sense, sure, you could use it. Right. So as is often the case, you have to look at specific meanings of a word, not just the word form as a whole, to tell whether something is, yeah, very much. But now notice here, very is modifying much, right? It's not modifying adores, right? So how much? It's telling us the extent of the muchness, right? So very there is modifying much. All right, let's look at adverbs. So adverbs and adjectives are extremely close to each other. And in fact, adjectives modify nouns, and adverbs modify pretty much everything other than nouns. So they exist in a kind of complementary distribution, and that's complement with an E, not with an I, as they're not saying nice things about each other. Together, they make up a complete set, right, of modifiers. So adverbs don't modify nouns, right? You can say a new movie, but you can't say they experienced the movie. Right? Because new is an adjective, right? So it can modify a noun, but it can't modify a verb. Quite is an adverb, right? So they quite liked it. Quite modifies liked. That's fine. The quite appearance of it, right? Appearance is a noun. Quite doesn't work, right? So they have that. Much huge. Yes. Okay. Adverbs, like I said, modify everything else. So notice the snowstorm appeared suddenly. So suddenly modifies appeared, the verb. Ellie almost died. I'm using adverb with an ly and adverb without, just to show you some of the differences here. Ellie almost died making the jump. So died, it almost is modifying died. It's an adverb, right? Notice the suddenly tense situation took Joel and Tommy by surprise. So notice tense is an adjective. It modifies situation. Suddenly is talking about how tense it was. So it's modifying tense. So the adjective modifies the noun. The adverb modifies the adjective. And then her smile was almost undetectable. Notice undetectable here. It's a predicative adjective, but it's still an adjective. So almost is modifying that. Now, suddenly the air duct collapsed beneath Ellie. Here, suddenly is modifying not any one particular thing, any one particular word here, but the entire predicate, the whole thing. So it's modifying the whole clause. It's telling us how the air duct collapsed, right? Maria, so adverbs can modify clauses as well as individual words. Maria almost always gets her way. So always is an adverb. Almost is modifying another adverb, right? Ellie and Dina found downtown Seattle almost without inhabitants. So here, without, I haven't actually talked about prepositions yet, but without is a preposition. So almost is modifying without, right? Adverbs modify verbs, everything except nouns. So they can modify verbs. They get their name because one of their most common functions is to modify verbs. But they can also modify adjectives and adverbs and clauses and prepositions. Basically, adjectives modify nouns. Adverbs modify everything except nouns. Does that make sense? So I have examples up here on the screen of this stuff. So notice, snowstorm appeared suddenly. Okay, so the first two, snowstorm appeared suddenly and Ellie almost died. These are adverbs modifying verbs, right? So suddenly modifies appeared, almost modifies died, okay? However, look at the third example here. Suddenly tense situation. So notice, suddenly is modifying tense. Tense is an adjective, not a verb. Right? Yeah, almost always is another one. Exactly right. So notice almost undetectable. So notice here, almost, again, undetectable is an adjective. So the first two examples, the adverb modifies a verb. The second two examples, the adverb modifies an adjective, right? The third example, or the fifth example, the adverb modifies the whole clause. Not one word in it, but the whole thing. The sixth example, almost always. Always is an adverb. So almost is an adverb modifying another adverb, right? So, hey, feel clean. So barely made it out of Seattle, right? So barely is the adverb modifying the verb made. Exactly right. Right. So that case, it's doing the verb. The verb case is the most common one, but I want to draw your attention to the places where adverbs modify other things, not just verbs, right? The name might make you think it's just verbs, but it's not. Right. And then almost without inhabitants. Without inhabitants is a preposition phrase. So almost is modifying the preposition phrase, in this case. Any questions about that? I know, like I want to make sure, I know, So already asked the question, which is great, right? You got it? Excellent. Anybody else have questions about this? This is the sort of stuff, like, we're going to see more and more of this stuff that's going to be, it's going to take a little bit more time to wrap your mind around. So make sure that I don't rush over stuff that you're still working to understand, right? All right. So we kind of mentioned this with adjectives, but yeah, a lot of adverbs are formed by tacking on ly, but not all. Again, I mistyped this. This slide should read, many adverbs are gradable. So in other words, just as you can add very in front of adjectives, you can add very in front of adverbs, right? So they quarrel very frequently. Very frequent. So frequently is obviously an adverb, right? Very is modifying that. So very, so it does the same thing. So the very test will help you tell whether something is an adjective or adverb versus a verb, but it won't help you tell if it's an adjective or an adverb, if the form doesn't. Like if you see, for it. Not everything ending in ly is an adverb. This is something to be careful of, right? Notice, what part of speech is friendly here? Yep, exactly right. It is an adjective because it's modifying faces. So note it, like in terms of word origin, if you go back in history, ly is not originally an adverb suffix. It's actually originally an adjective forming suffix. And you can still see it in words like friendly. Now, and there's more in the history that I'll mention in just a second, but I've got to introduce one more term first, and that's the notion of a flat adverb. When we're talking about a flat adverb, what we're basically saying is the adjective and the adverb equivalent of each other have exactly the same shape. They don't have an ly ending. Oops. Why is it not showing? There we go. Okay, so notice he's a hard worker, adjective. He works hard, adverb. Now, perhaps more controversially, it's real gold, adjective. He's real nice, adverb, right? Now, the last one, obviously, in standard written English, wouldn't fly. The preference is for really. However, descriptively, in the spoken language, people use this form all the time, right? And lest you be too quick to judge it, it is actually the historically older form. Because, as I was indicating, that ly ending, if you go back to Old English, it was not the adverb forming ending. It was actually an adjective forming ending. And the way you formed an adverb was to add a final e, which was pronounced what we call a schwa. German actually still does this, right? To form adverbs by adding the at the end. What happened to that final schwa is in Middle English, it basically disappeared. So for example, hard, if you wanted to do the adverb form in Old English, it would be basically hard, right? That would be the adverb form. But that final just got dropped, giving us one form. The ly forms after it used to be lich for the adjective, and liche for the adverb, right? That ending for it. Eventually, the again, it dropped off, and so you're just left with lich, which just became li, and then that took over as the adverb form. But in the spoken language, you get a lot of this sort of, what that means is that you have basically the adjective and the adverb pronounced the same. And so a lot of these forms that are marked as sort of ignorant, uneducated, or whatever, simply go historically back to the old way of doing things, right? The written form, the standard English form has moved on a bit, right? But there's justification for it. All right. This is probably the trickiest question that I gave you in the test. Honestly, how many of you got this one right? You got it, Mickey? Excellent. Good for you. A lot of people go for 2 here. Notice though, and 2 can be a preposition. However, let me see if my daughter is listening. Can you take Kai outside? I think he needs to poop. You didn't see that question? Yeah. So 2 can be a preposition. Yes, Kai, I know. He's coming. So it's not surprising that you picked it. However, when to introduces a verb, like to have, it's not a preposition. It's a marker of the infinitive, right? We'll talk about exactly why that is the case when we go through infinitives in more detail with verb phrases and stuff. But the to the store, yes, that's exactly right, Mickey. But notice there, we're not following to with a verb, we're following with a noun phrase, the store. So here in the company, right? So we have a that's it. Yep. So in the company, just like to the store, it's followed by a noun phrase, right? So or at see, right? That's see. It's a noun or noun phrase. So same thing. So we have there another sort of thing. Can is a verb, is an auxiliary verb, right? So is an adverb. So, as well as the name of Ahmad. Okay, so what are prepositions, right? So basically, in terms of like general meaning or whatever, it relates one part of a sentence to another. So prepositions have a big connecting function within sentences. They don't necessarily relate the same thing. They can relate a lot of different kinds of things to one another, right? Which is why I just say one unit. I'm being vague about that. We'll see a lot of the different things in context later. Often prepositions in terms of meaning will express some kind of space or time. Those are the principal meanings of prepositions. And for that reason, a lot of grade school teachers, I think I mentioned this last week, they'll use a mnemonic to help their little kids learn what prepositions are by saying things like, the one that I had heard was, it's like all the things that an airplane can do with a cloud, right? Through, in, around, behind, over, under, all of those kinds of things. And I know Tuffy was contributing something. I forget exactly what he learned, but different people have heard different things there. But the basic idea is to get you to sort of generate all these different spatial things. So put it, and that space doesn't have to be literal space. It can be metaphorical position, right? So if I say I'm putting it in a nutshell, obviously that's an idiom. I'm summarizing something, but it's based on that physical space, right? Nervous throughout the run, right? That kind of thing. Now, I should have given a time example, but like before can be, or after can be used for time as well as space. Things like that. There are some prepositions whose use is almost entirely grammaticalized. In other words, they don't have this clear time or space meaning with them anymore, or ever. So of is a big one, the heart of the matter. We call this grammaticalized because it seems to be purely a marker of grammar rather than carrying a lot of inherent meaning. It's kind of hard to put your finger on exactly how to define up for this, right? You'll also notice that prepositions have a consistent structure. For the stuff that we've looked at so far, we'll see exceptions later. It's followed by a phrase, almost always a noun phrase, right? The thing that comes after the preposition here is called the object of the preposition. So just as verbs can have objects, right? When we're like direct and indirect objects, you might have heard of, prepositions can have objects as well. Right? So So look for that pattern of preposition followed by a noun phrase is by far the most common pattern, right? So, and if you see that, and especially if the word is talking about location or in some sense, space or time in some sense, then we're probably talking about a preposition, right? At the beginning, I mentioned the difference between content and function words, right? Prepositions are sort of on the border, or they're a borderline case. They do have some semantic content. Like when we're talking about space and time, that's definitely meaningful, right? However, prepositions are, in contrast with like verbs or nouns, are a much more limited category. There are tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of nouns and verbs respectively in English, right? However, there are only a few hundred prepositions, right? They do have some meaning, some significant meaning, but they are as much function words as they are content words, right? Prepositions do not have any inflectional endings. You don't have number or tense or any of those things for prepositions. However, just as with adjectives, a lot of them you can grade. Like you can add the word right. It doesn't take the word very, but it takes the word right. So Brenda fell right off the ledge. It's probably Brenda isn't here today, unfortunately. I wrote that just for her. But anyway, notice right here is talking about the quality of how off the ledge she is, directly off the ledge, right? So notice it's an intensifier that's modifying that preposition, right? The uses of prepositions that have become grammaticalized, though, cannot take this, right? So compare these examples, right? Like if we add right. So of, we've already said, is a grammaticalized use of a preposition, right? There's not a lot of independent meaning there. And notice you can't add right in front of it. You can't say the relaxed days right of summer, right? Consider, though, by. Some functions of by have that spatial meaning, right? By the exit. And when it's used in that spatial sense, the Seraphite with the shotgun waited right by the exit. So we're intensifying by there, right? They can imply space. Yeah, absence. Yeah, I if I'm understanding what you're saying, so goes, yes, that's exactly right. But notice the third example here. The WLF were ambushed right by a Seraphite patrol. Now, don't think of this as right next to a Seraphite patrol. Not in that sense. But the Seraphite patrol is the one doing the ambushing. Right? That's not grammatical. Like, you can't insert right here if you mean that they were ambushed by a Seraphite patrol, right? Because by here is being used grammatically to mark the actor. This is a passive voice construction, and it's marking that. So it can't be used always. All right. Okay. Those five, which I've spent the most time on, are the major categories. Now I'm going to very quickly go over, just by way of wrapping things up, some of the minor categories in English. I'm not going to say a huge amount about them today. This is just overview. We're going to see them as these are the functional categories. We're going to see them in operation as we look at how they appear in phrases. The biggest one, and the one that is maybe unfamiliar to you, is a category called the determinative. this is not a term that's in traditional grammar, but it's something that linguists are pretty much universally agreed is a real thing, and should be. That these are words, they appear before nouns. Their main purpose is to specify whether something is definite or indefinite. And the core examples of determinatives are the articles, right? The, a, an. Traditional grammar calls those adjectives. They're not, and I will explain why they're not next week. Right. So these are some of the common determinatives. So the definite and indefinite articles, right? Is the WLF an abbreviation? That depend. If you say WLF, it's an abbreviation. If you say wolf, it's become an acronym. Right? So it's all in the pronunciation. This, that, these, those, the so-called demonstrative pronouns, right? Those are also determinatives. Quantifiers, all, both, right? All of these numbers. These are all, they specify a noun, whether it's definite or indefinite, whether what kind of number, what kind of count it has. That kind of specification turns out to be distinct from adjective modification and needs its own part of speech. So we call those determinatives. You will also see these called determiners. I'm going to use that term, but in a slightly different way. Again, we'll explain it next time. So, yeah. A few other minor categories: coordinators, right? Joining equal units together, and, but, or, right? Subordinators, that, whether, if. These have an unequal relationship. So Abby vowed that she would get revenge. So notice, she would get revenge. That's a full, like, on its own, that could be a full sentence, right? In the context of this sentence, it's a subordinate part. It tells us what Abby vowed, right? Same thing with whether. Maria asked Dina whether she would go with Ellie, right? So the she would go with Ellie could be a separate sentence on its own, but here it's a subordinate part. It's the thing that Maria asked Dina about, right? So subordinator, coordinator. The final one, interjection. An interjection is something that's grammatically unrelated to the rest of the sentence. Oh, shucks, things like that. Their main use is to express feeling, right? Now, a few distinctions. I'm going to start, I just kind of quickly threw those out, but I want to start getting you thinking about actually making these distinctions, making these judgments for yourself. So, one of the things I want to instill in you is the habit of thinking with evidence. Traditionally, what I just called subordinators and coordinators are called subordinating and coordinating conjunctions, right? They go under the broader term of conjunction. I'm not going to call them that, and the main reason I'm not going to call them that is subordinators and coordinators, in fact, work totally differently from each other. They don't have a lot in common grammatically, so there doesn't seem to be any point in regarding them as related species to each other. Now, in traditional grammar, there are a lot of things that are called subordinating conjunctions that I'm not going to. And I thought I would use this as a way of showing you the kinds of logic that we're going to be applying, because we want our descriptive system to match as best we can the actual way the language works, right? So traditionally, if we take a word like after, what traditional grammar will say is sometimes it's a preposition and sometimes it's a subordinating conjunction, right? Hey, so it's fine. I'm giving you the overview here. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to put the slides. I'm going to put a link to the slides in Discord. I'll put the video up on on Discord. I don't expect you to get it the first time. I'm going to give you some exercises. We're going to work through some of them together. If you choose, you can work through more as homework. The best way to wrapping your mind around all these terms is to work through the analysis yourself, right? And that's what we're about to start doing. Okay, because I want you to start thinking like linguists and be able to do this stuff for yourself. Right? I just threw a crap ton of stuff at you. I kind of have to throw it out there because we need all these terms to start working with things. We can't do one in isolation, right? Okay, so after work. Notice work is a noun. Therefore, after is a preposition. In other words, traditional grammar always assumes that prepositions are always followed by nouns. After she left work. So notice here we have work, but we also have a verb. We have what's called a clause. She left work, right? When it's followed by a clause, they call it a subordinating conjunction, right? Okay, but does this distinction actually make sense? Just because the labels are traditional doesn't mean they are right. Yeah. Yeah, communicating the knowledge, that's exactly right. So, and I particularly understand, that's, lining it up with the terms you're familiar with is a perfectly sensible operating procedure. Okay. Notice these. So in an ideal world, I would throw out these examples to you and just ask you, what does this show? Right. However, I know you haven't yet experienced like what you need to look for here. So I'm going to walk you through this by way of sort of illustrating the thought process that I'm hoping to sort of inculcate you with, right? I've got a bunch of examples. Notice I've got after here. Yuri returned the phone call right after work. This is exactly what we were talking about before. We can add these intensifiers, these modifiers in front of a preposition, right? Right after work, immediately after work, 30 minutes after work. All of those work fine. Okay. We can also add them after, in front of after, even though what follows is a clause. Yuri returned the phone call right after she wrote the email. Yuri returned the phone call 30 minutes after she wrote the email, right? All right, Santolo. Thanks for showing up. Really appreciate it. Have a good night's sleep. So notice that we can do that. We can add that thing, but we cannot add this in front of that or whether. Yuri claimed right that she returned the phone call. Yuri asked right whether I had returned the phone call. Neither of those is grammatical. Right? That and whether, even traditional grammar would agree, is a subordinator, right? It's making this what follows subordinate to what's going on. But they behave totally differently from the after. In other words, traditional grammar makes a prediction by saying that there's a difference between the prepositions and the subordinating conjunctions, right? They're making a prediction. That prediction, is that the things that we call subordinating conjunctions should behave in the same way, but they don't, right? Some behave differently from others. In fact, some that are traditionally called subordinating conjunctions behave like prepositions. And in fact, that's really what they are, right? Yeah. Does the logic there make sense? Yeah. Our basic thing here, remember, is what we're saying when we're saying that a word belongs to a lexical category, we're saying that it has shared properties, right? So it ought to behave in the same way. So that and whether behave one way, right? After behaves a different way, no matter what comes after, right? No matter whether it's followed by a noun phrase or a clause, right? And for that reason, what we are saying, or what I am saying, is that there's no reason to distinguish the two kinds of afters because they behave exactly the same. However, there is a reason to distinguish that and whether from after, right? So two different groups. Right. We've already seen when we're trying to tell apart parts of speech, which groups are those? So the after is a preposition, that and whether are subordinators. Okay. We already we talked about this already. You guys were sharp enough to pick this up when we were talking earlier. Exactly. So what part of speech is water in each sentence? Exactly right. Exactly right. So water the lawn, that's a verb structure. Spill water, spill the water, right? That's the noun. One good way, if you're trying to figure out what part of speech a particular word is a substitution test. In other words, take the hard word that you're unsure about and swap in a word that you are sure about, right? Right. So consider examples like this. Tim is better at chess than I am. Tim plays chess better than I do. Now, given that this is an ER form, we know that these are either adjectives or adverbs, or one of each, right? The question is, how do we tell? The easiest way to tell is to do a substitution, right? So we might substitute, what could we substitute for? How about a word like skillful, right? Tim is more skillful at chess than I am. Gooder. Tim plays chess more skillfully than I do, right? So skillful, first one, adjective. More skillfully, second one, adverb. So was exactly right. First one is an adjective, second one's an adverb, right? Here's a slightly trickier one. Ing words, we talked about them in context of being participles. They're not always functioning as verb forms. What part of speech is that? Oh yeah, real gold. It's really gold. Yes, that's exactly right, Clean. That is exactly right. Real gold, adjective, right? It's true gold, pure gold, right? Because of modifying the noun gold. Really gold, it is actually gold. So in that case, really is not modifying gold anymore. It's part of the verb phrase, right? It's intensifying. No, it's not. In that case, the really is a comment on the situation, on the it is actually. So it's modifying the verb phrase, not the noun phrase. That's a slightly more complicated situation. Yep, painting is a noun, right? Notice it comes from the verb to paint, but it has been purely converted into a pure noun, the painting. No problem with that one. Okay. Now, let's look at these two. I'll give you two at once. What do you think about charming in these examples? Adverb verb. Does everyone agree? So in this case, charming is not modifying was for Christina. Charming is for the first Christina example. Charming is telling us a quality of Christina. Yeah, it's an adjective. Charming is an adjective. And then the second one is a verb form. Okay. Now, there are a couple of ways we can be sure this is the case, right? This is one of those linking verb patterns. So it's a predicative adjective where it comes after the linking verb, right? There's a couple of ways we can tell. The first one is we can use the very test. Remember I mentioned the very test? It won't let us distinguish adjective and adverb, but it will let us distinguish adjective from verb, right? So Christina was very charming to her guests. Correct, right? Christina was very charming her guests. Second one does not work, right? So very doesn't work in front of a verb. So was very charming her guests. That's a verb form. Does not work, right? But charming to her guests does work, right? That's a straight up adjective. So these ing forms can become adjectives, and you may need to use that little test to tell, right? Occasionally it'll be ambiguous. If the verb form, if it's not a word that takes a degree, then it could be either. It could be ambiguous. Sometimes for all of our tests, it's still ambiguous, and that's okay. We don't have to be 100% certain all the time. All right. I got some homework for you. If you choose to do it, it'll be in the Discord. But before I set you free on that, I thought we would do a little practice ourselves and analyze this stuff. Okay? So, why not an adverb? Okay, so remember, not every Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all, Christina as a proper noun isn't going to take an adjective most of the time. But you could say the charming woman, right? So it does work in front of it. But also remember, not every adjective is an attributive adjective. Sometimes they're predicative only, right? So that's not a distinct, charming Christina, yeah. We don't normally, you can do it, but it's not normal to put an adjective in front of a proper noun. Proper nouns normally are by themselves in the noun phrase, right? Charming Christina was blank to her guests. Well, I mean, was nice to her guests, was polite to her guests. You need another adjective to go in there, right? No, it refers to Christina. Christina, would you agree? Okay, look, let's take remember I talked about a substitution test? Let's substitute something that's clearly not derived from a verb. Christina was polite to her guests. Right? That's an adjective, only can be an adjective. There's no other possibility, right? Politely is the adverb form. There's no verb to polite, right? So that slot after to be is a slot that can be occupied by an adjective phrase, right? And that's what's going on with charming in that case. And this is why the substitution test can be helpful to help us distinguish these kinds of situations. And by the way, I love this kind of question. Don't feel like asking this question shows me that you're thinking and gives me the chance to sort of reiterate these tests and apply it. Right? Well, it doesn't go in front of Christina because it's a proper noun, but it would go in front of a common noun, right? So if you had something like, if you had the charming woman, there's nothing wrong with that. Right? And charming Christina, polite Christina, I mean, that's a little bit anomalous. It's not 100% wrong, but you normally wouldn't say it. But that's because of the proper noun. Yeah. You can create a context bins where it works, right? It's just not it's not a standard everyday pattern, right? Well, the thing is, so you're trying to move one part of the sentence and you can't just move that and leave the rest alone, right? When we're talking about like, so notice, consider the difference between, I'm just typing this out in chat so you can see it. The charming woman, and let's leave Christina out of it so we get the proper noun out of the equation to avoid confusion. So notice these two examples aren't precisely parallel because the charming woman is just a noun phrase and the woman was charming is a complete sentence, right? So it's not about, what we're not doing here, we're giving two separate examples that illustrate the different forms. We're not converting from one to another by rearranging, right? So we will do some of that rearrangement as a test later on. That's a legitimate kind of thing. But in this case, we have two different things, right? Well, if we say the woman was charming her guests, right? So the difference is if we say charming her guests, then her guests is the direct object of the verb charming, right? If we say the woman was charming. Yes, verb is correct. To her guests, right? What we're saying is this is an adjective, right? But notice if you say the charming woman was, right, what you're trying to do, this is, if I'm understanding you, what you're trying to do is sort of rearrange these components, right? But this is not one of those cases where you can rearrange the words, right? They're two different structures. And you can't get from point A to point B just by juggling. It's not just a matter of alternate word order. It's a different syntactic structure, right? So there is no gap or anything like that if you're thinking in those terms, right? That is a kind of argument that we use for different patterns later on, right? Yeah. Now, in this case, what's charming there? The fabulous and polite woman. The whole, it applies to the entire noun phrase, not to any one unit there. It's not different from the to her guests one. The only thing that's different is, no, the verb is just was. It's just the linking verb in both cases, right? And again, you can do the polite substitution test. The verb doesn't refer to, the verb is what's called a linking verb. So was, so with a linking verb, the basic idea is you have woman, right? You know, you have two things. You have like a woman and charming, and they're just linked together. The verb functions more or less as an equals sign, right? Well, then why wouldn't we say charmingly? Like, it would be incorrect to say the woman was charmingly to her guests. Right? I mean, it is true that colloquially there are, flat forms. Like in theory, charming could be an adverb and we're just speaking informally, right? But if that's the case, the ly form is still available to us if that's an actual adverb slot. It is not available to us here, right? So you can't say, politely to her guests or charmingly to her. So the woman was charmingly to her guests, right? You could say the woman was behaving charmingly to her guests. So now charmingly is glomming on to behaving, which is not a linking verb, right? It could do it. So in that case, behave would take the adverb, right? But linking verbs like to be don't take the adverbs, right? If you can have adverbs. The earlier example that I think Santolo gave, where you had to be and an adverb inside there, I pointed out that was a little bit of a complicated example. Like, we're not quite ready for that, but that's not applying to the verb per se. That's applying to the entire clause in a way. Yeah, that's because of the linking verb. Yep, it's a special type of verb. We'll talk about that when we talk about verb types. We'll go through all the major verb types for that. So this is we're seeing all these examples of places where the quick overview isn't quite enough to give you the thing. Like, I could give you another 2 hours or so of this, right? That's okay. That's why we're going to practice. The more you practice, the more second nature this will come. So, for everybody, not just so, take a look at this sentence, and for every word in the sentence, see if you can identify the part of speech. I'll give you a few minutes for that. Yep. This is why we're starting here. Or I can just call it off word at a time if you want. What's Abby? Abby's a subject, but that subject is not a part of speech, right? What kind of noun is it? Proper noun indeed. Yes. What about expressed? Yep. Verb it is. In the past tense. Exactly. How about displeasure? I like verb. A nuon? Yes. So we have a verbs and nuons. Yeah, displeasure is a noun. Yes. So notice, even though there's no definite article or something like that, you could say things like the displeasure, right? Currently finding it, letters are getting mixed up. No worries, Kiwi. No worries. How about about? Are we at 4 hours? Crap, we're at 4 hours. Shit. I go forever when I'm talking to you guys. I apologize. Yeah, it is a preposition. It's exactly right. The. I'll take either the traditional term. It's an article. Yep, that's the traditional term. Definite article is the traditional term. Determinative is the new one that I threw out, which I don't expect you to remember. How about mess? Noun it is. And in? Yep. In is a preposition. Her. And finally, room. And a noun. It's perfect. See, you guys got that one? No problem. All right. How about this one? You have a question, Kiwi? Excellent question. So, her, we are not going to call her an adjective. Traditional grammar would say it's a kind of adjective. I will talk next week about why that's not the best analysis. It is a modifier of the noun. Or a specifier of the noun. Let's put it that way. The possessive pronouns are. I introduced the idea of a determinative, right, which is a part of speech. Right, so for the articles and other related words. But there's also a closely related function that determinatives do, which words other than determinatives can do, which is called the determiner function. And possessive pronouns can do that function. So they're determiners. So not their modifier isn't even, I mean, technically, like for now we can call it a modifier. Technically, it's not quite the same thing, but like I said, modifier has a technical meaning. Untechnically, it's a modifier of the noun. So not everything that modifies a noun is an adjective, right? And I have sort of deliberately withheld talking about some of that. If you all do all the homework that I have for you, that will be an issue that you'll have to sort of decide for yourselves. Well, I'll explain when we get there. Let's do this next one. She sprinted straight up the stairs. She pronoun, verb, adverb, preposition, definite article, noun. Exactly right, Bins. No mush. She, yeah. If you want to call she a noun, that's okay, right? Pronouns obviously I've already said they're a subtype of noun, so technically noun is correct, right? Pronoun is the more precise term. You did a thing. Why is it not giving me the next one? Yeah, so straight is an adverb here because notice it's modifying up the stairs, right? So up is a preposition, right? And so anything, if it's modifying anything other than a noun, it's an adverb. So straight there is an adverb. Now, straight can function as an adjective in different contexts, right? But there it's an adverb. How about here? Owen. That one's pretty straightforward. Yeah. Proper noun, verb, adverb. Yes. Up to the comma is correct. Pronoun, verb, adverb. Maybe your brain is mush, Bins. Proper. If you meant to say proper noun rather than pronoun, you're correct. Yeah. Proper. Yeah, close enough, right? So, yes, you said that. So, am I right? So goes that you're saying for the preposition is near? All right. Yeah, that is correct. Near here is a preposition. Right? So near the end, spatial thing followed by a noun phrase. That's fine. So the end article, noun, of preposition, his pronoun or determinative, tolerance, noun, right? All right. No, I didn't do this one right. Oh, well. Well, we live with what we made. I had intended to use near in a different part of speech in this one, but I didn't. Home Depot, yes. Trying to be Tilu friendly in these examples. So let me, rather than have you do every single word here, let me just ask you selected few. What is hard in this sentence? So we have a little bit of a split opinion. We have adjective versus adverb. What word is hard modifying? It's a hard turn. It is the turn hard and left? Or is it telling you how left you went? Is it the degree of leftness? Yeah, hard left tells you how left it is, right? If that were the case, Kiwi, if that were the intended meaning, you'd have to put a comma between hard and left, right? But a hard left turn means a sharp left turn, right? Like it's going directly to that. And since left is and yeah, but even if it's not how you say it in Australia, Bins, you still can analyze it as she is wrote. In other words, like it doesn't have to be your native idiom to sort of analyze how it works, right? So anyway, hard is actually telling us the degree of leftness. At least I would argue that. And therefore, it's an adverb, not an adjective, right? Hard is one of those flat adverbs that doesn't, like, hard as an adverb is fine. It's standard. Hardly is an adverb, but it means something totally different, right? I work hard is not the same as I hardly work, right? Yeah. Exactly. Working hard, hardly working. Appropriate, since I actually did have several typos in these slides. Right. Let's see. What's oops? There are times, so goes, where you can have two adjectives in a row. We'll look at that when we look at noun phrases. It's not the normal situation, but it can happen. Oops is an interjection. Exactly. Like, hey. It's an interjection. It's not grammatically connected to the sentence. It expresses a feeling rather than any particular part of meaning that's connected to the rest of the sentence. So it's an interjection. What about more? I mean, just based on the kind of roots of that word, so I would think interjection, that sounds like it ought to translate interjection to me. Yeah, so no, yes and no are often analyzed as interjections. That's debatable whether they actually are, but anyway, it's very likely that you have seen no or yes analyzed as an interjection. Like that's a common thing that people will say. So whether or not it's true is a complicated matter. It probably is not, but I won't get into that now. Wait would not be one. Wait would be a verb because you're giving a command, right? Stop, wait. Bravo could be an interjection, yeah, because it's just sort of expressing a vague feeling, right? Often, it's usually things like oh, arg, right? Yeah, damn could, yeah, that can be an interjection, exactly. Although, like, hell can be an interjection, but it can also be a noun, right? If I say, in fact, I was contemplating, I almost, although it was a little more complicated than I wanted to do, I almost pulled out burn in hell, or burn in hell pendejo as an example for the quiz. Like what's an interjection? The problem is, yeah, that makes sense. So it goes. The problem is it gets complicated. I didn't have a good interjection to go with it, but burn in hell, that's a literal noun. It's grammatically integrated with the sentence. It has a meaning, right? Even though you could just say, hell, right? Which is just a straight up interjection. So. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to put this in. It's time for me to wrap things up. This is going to be for homework if you choose to do it, since several of you asked for homework. All right. Your job here is to identify the part of speech of every word in this opening paragraph of City of Thebes. Okay? Now, I would tell you that this won't be easy. There are some things in here. I mean, most of these things will be straightforward. Most of these will be like the sentences we just went through together. But there are a few things that you might look at and excuse me, they will raise issues that we haven't talked about yet. I hope you will do some of this, at least the first few lines or something, right? Give yourself some practice, because wrestling with the hard points, the things that aren't given to you on a platter, is an incredibly important way of really gaining your footing in this stuff, right? And seeing, like, what is it about the traditional way that we look at these things and yeah, you appreciate the heavy use of the M dash. Yeah, excuse me. Things that you take for granted when you're just sort of told about them. If you're trying to actually apply it, you'd be like, but wait a minute, what's up with this thing, right? And working through those problems can make sure that you get this all sorted out in your minds, right? The reason why I picked this was mostly because it's Brenda's book club reading, which is due next week. So we're going to be talking about this on the 9th. If anybody, who isn't yet joining the book club would be interested in doing that. So this will be, like I said, I'll post this in Discord. Yeah, reading City of Thebes. If any of you are not familiar with this book, this is the book that Abby is reading when she wakes up at the very beginning of day one, Seattle day one for her. And so we are, and it's also a very good book. I'm about a quarter of the way through it right now. I got to finish it quickly before the book club. But you never solved a math problem in the final years of high school. You know, I didn't take math my final year of high school, but the reason I didn't is because by my junior year, I had finished all the math they offered. I thought they were going to give me a free period or something, but instead they made me take 2 English classes. So. Abby is cultured. That is true. Abby is a big reader, right? She loans out books to people. Yeah. Yeah, I never minded math. That was okay for me. But all right. Does anyone have any last questions before we go off and raid somebody? This was a bit of a fire hose dump today, and you know, I'm trying to balance like getting this done in a relatively, you know, condensed period of time with just overwhelming you all with too much information. You know, we're going to be getting more into analysis. I'm going to be doing, hopefully, you know, this was a big catalog of a bunch of stuff just to give you an overview. I'm going to try to get us into just like analyzing language. We're still going to be introducing a bunch of new topics, but, you know, hopefully it won't be quite as, you know, yeah, that's the thing. It's like, there's a lot of information here. Nobody will remember it all the first time. Working through it is the best way to learn it. Review, stuff like that. You did get your alcohol and radish info. Yep. So. You think very abstractly. Well, that can be corrected, Bins. That can be correct. Although, frankly, abstract thinking is fine for linguistics. You just have to be able to apply it to stuff, right? Yes, we are going to raid Cress. Thank you, everybody who hung out for this very long stream, nearly 4.5 hours. It's a bloody long time for me to be talking about this. He's working on no healing grounded permadeath, but per chapter. So, Phoenix, hello, hello. Bad timing. We are actually raiding Cress right now. So, hey, Data Wizard, how are you? Thank you for that follow. Scar, everybody. Mickey, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, appreciate it a lot, man. So we just had a class on grammar for adults. And we're about to go raid Cress, who's doing no healing grounded perma per chapter right now. We're going to see how he's doing. So thank you for the raid. I'm sorry it didn't last longer. I hope you all will come next time. My next stream, I'll be doing another grounded perma run on Saturday morning. I hope to see you all there.